Harold Mason had spent 40 years working the same stretch of land, but the soil had turned stubborn and dry, and the bank was no longer willing to wait for a miracle. His wife had left him 2 winters ago, and his only son had moved to the city without a backward glance. Harold was alone in a farmhouse that smelled of dust and regret, staring at foreclosure papers he could not pay. That was when he noticed the strange behavior of his neighbor, Edward Crane. Edward lived half a mile down the dirt road, a quiet man who kept to himself and never caused trouble. Everyone in the small town respected Edward because he always paid his bills on time and helped mend fences after storms. But Harold had seen something odd. For 3 nights in a row, Edward had carried heavy wooden crates from his truck into his basement, always after midnight, always with the lights off. Harold tried to ignore it, but his curiosity grew like a weed. One afternoon, while checking his property line near Edward's barn, Harold smelled a sour odor drifting from a cracked basement window. It was the smell of something dead, not an animal, but something larger. Harold hesitated for a long moment, then forced himself to look through the gap in the boards. The basement was dim, but a single bare bulb hung from a wire, and under it lay a human form wrapped in a tarp, with one pale hand sticking out. Harold stumbled backward and vomited into the weeds. He did not call the sheriff. He did not tell a soul. Instead, he walked home in a daze and sat at his kitchen table until dawn. The next morning, Harold gathered every piece of courage he had left and walked to Edward's front door. Edward opened it with a polite nod, his face calm and unreadable. Harold said nothing about the body. He simply looked Edward in the eye and whispered that he knew about the basement, and that for $50,000, he would keep his mouth shut. Edward's expression did not change. He invited Harold inside and poured 2 cups of coffee. Then he agreed to the terms. That was the beginning of a bargain that would destroy them both. Harold received the first payment in cash 3 days later, wrapped in a brown envelope left inside his mailbox. He used the money to make a loan payment, and the bank granted him a short extension. For a few weeks, Harold almost convinced himself that he had done nothing wrong. He told himself that Edward was a killer, and that taking money from a killer was not a crime, but a kind of justice. But the silence between them grew heavier with each passing month. Edward would wave at Harold from a distance, and Harold would wave back, and both men knew that the other was pretending. Harold started having nightmares. He dreamed of the pale hand reaching out from the tarp, and he woke up gasping for air, soaked in sweat. He tried to drink away the fear, but whiskey only made the visions sharper. Edward, meanwhile, began to change. He stopped coming out of his house during the day. His truck remained parked for weeks. His mail piled up. Then one night, Harold saw a light in Edward's basement again, and he heard the sound of a shovel striking packed earth. Edward was digging. Not to hide something new, but to move something old. Harold realized with sickening clarity that Edward was not afraid of him. Edward was merely waiting. The payments continued, but the amounts grew smaller and the intervals longer. When Harold finally confronted Edward about the missing money, Edward smiled for the first time in months. He said that Harold had become a problem, and that problems had a way of solving themselves. Harold returned home and locked every door. He kept a shotgun by his bed. He stopped sleeping. One evening, a woman named Margaret Doyle, who ran the general store on the main road, came to Harold's farm to deliver a refund check for overcharged supplies. Harold was not home, so Margaret left the envelope under his doormat. But as she walked back to her car, she noticed that Edward's truck was parked behind a clump of trees near Harold's eastern field, which made no sense because Edward had no business on Harold's land. Margaret was a curious woman by nature, and she had seen Harold and Edward speaking in hushed tones many times. She decided to take a short walk toward the tree line. She did not find Edward, but she found a shallow hole covered with branches, and underneath the branches, a blood-stained tarp. Margaret did not scream. She walked calmly back to her car, drove home, and sat in her living room for 2 hours before picking up the phone. She did not call the sheriff either. Instead, she called Harold. She told him that she knew everything, and that she wanted $20,000 for her silence. Harold felt the world tilt beneath his feet. He had created a monster, and now that monster had spawned another. He agreed to meet Margaret the next night at a neutral location, the old grain silo at the edge of town. But Harold also made his second call. He called Edward and said that someone else had discovered the body, and that if Edward wanted to keep his freedom, he would help Harold handle the situation. Edward laughed on the other end of the line. He said he would come to the silo, but not to help Harold. He said he would come to watch. The night of the meeting was cold and moonless, with a wind that carried the smell of rain from the distant hills. Harold arrived at the grain silo an hour early, carrying his shotgun under a long coat. He had not eaten in 2 days, and his hands shook from a mixture of fear and exhaustion. He leaned against the rusted metal door of the silo and waited. Edward came next, walking out of the darkness without a sound. He carried no weapon that Harold could see, but there was a calmness in his movements that felt more dangerous than any gun. Edward stopped 10 feet away and folded his arms. He asked Harold if he had brought the money for Margaret. Harold said no, because he had no money left, not even for his next loan payment. Edward nodded as if he had expected that answer. Then Margaret arrived, stepping out of her car with a flashlight in one hand and a heavy wrench in the other. She was a large woman in her 50s, with short gray hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. She looked at Harold, then at Edward, and she understood immediately that she had walked into a trap. But she did not run. Instead, she raised the wrench and told both men that she wanted her $20,000 by sunrise, or she would go to the sheriff and tell him everything, including the exact location of the tarp. Edward chuckled softly. He said that Margaret had no idea what she was dealing with, and that the body under the tarp was not the only one Edward had buried on his property. There were 3 more, he said, scattered across the back 40 acres, victims of arguments that had escalated over the past decade. Harold felt his knees buckle. He had thought he knew the worst of Edward, but this was a bottomless pit of horror. Margaret lowered the wrench for just a second, and that second was all Edward needed. He lunged forward with a speed that did not belong to a man his age, grabbed Margaret's wrist, and twisted until the wrench clattered to the ground. Margaret screamed, a short, sharp sound that was swallowed by the wind. Harold raised his shotgun, but his hands were trembling so badly that he could not aim. Edward pulled Margaret toward the silo door and told Harold to open it. Harold did not move. Edward repeated himself, louder this time, and Harold finally fumbled with the latch and pulled the heavy door open. The inside of the silo was pitch black and smelled of old grain and mouse droppings. Edward shoved Margaret inside, and she fell onto a pile of rotten burlap sacks. Then Edward turned to Harold and said that now they had a real problem. Margaret had seen Edward's face, heard him admit to 3 more murders, and could not be allowed to leave the silo alive. Harold stared at the open door. He could hear Margaret scrambling to her feet inside, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Edward told Harold that he would do the dirty work himself, but that Harold would have to help him clean up afterward. That was the price of Harold's silence from now on. No more money. Just labor. Harold thought about his farm, about the bank, about the years of his life that had amounted to nothing. Then he thought about the pale hand in the basement, and about Margaret's daughter, a young woman who worked at the post office and always smiled at Harold when he came to town. He could not add another body to Edward's collection. He raised the shotgun again, and this time his hands were steady. He fired from the hip, and the blast caught Edward in the left shoulder, spinning him around and dropping him to his knees. Edward did not scream. He looked down at the blood soaking through his jacket, then up at Harold with an expression of genuine surprise. He asked why. Harold did not answer. He stepped past Edward and reached into the silo, grabbing Margaret by the arm and pulling her out into the open air. She was crying, but she was alive. Harold told her to run to her car and drive to the sheriff, and not to look back. Margaret hesitated for only a moment, then ran. Harold heard her car engine start and the tires spin on the gravel as she sped away. Edward had crawled to a sitting position, his good hand pressed against the wound. He said that Harold had just signed his own death warrant. The sheriff would ask questions, and Edward would tell a beautiful story about how Harold had tried to blackmail him for years, and how Margaret was a liar and a thief. But Harold knew that Edward was bluffing. The truth was that Edward could not afford an investigation any more than Harold could. The bodies in his backyard would not stay hidden forever if the police started digging. Harold walked over to Edward and knelt down so that their faces were inches apart. He said nothing, because no words were needed. Edward understood that the balance of power had shifted. Harold helped Edward to his feet and walked him back toward Edward's truck. He said that they would drive together to Edward's house, and that Edward would write a full confession, and then they would call the sheriff together. Edward laughed again, a wet, gurgling sound. He said that Harold was a fool if he thought a piece of paper would protect him. But Harold did not care about protection anymore. He only cared about ending the nightmare. They drove in silence to Edward's farmhouse, the headlights cutting through the darkness like knives. Edward went inside to get a pen and paper, and Harold waited by the truck with the shotgun resting across his knees. 10 minutes passed. Then 20. Harold grew uneasy and walked to the front door. It was unlocked. He stepped inside and called Edward's name. No answer. He searched the living room, the kitchen, the bathroom. Then he opened the basement door. The light was on. At the bottom of the stairs, Edward lay face down in a widening pool of blood. He had used his own hunting knife to open an artery in his wrist. Beside his body was a note written in shaky handwriting. It said only, "Tell my mother I am sorry." Harold stood at the top of the stairs and felt nothing. Not relief, not sadness, not even shock. He turned and walked out of the house, leaving the door open behind him. The confession Edward had refused to write would never exist. But the bodies in the backyard would be found eventually, by some future owner or a curious dog. Harold did not care about that either. He walked home through the fields, under a sky that was beginning to show the first hints of dawn. When he reached his farmhouse, he sat down on the porch steps and waited for the sheriff's car to arrive. Margaret had told her story by now, and the sheriff would have questions. Harold decided that he would tell the truth about everything except one detail. He would say that Edward had confessed to the murders before killing himself, and that Harold had only tried to stop him. It was a lie, but it was a small one, and Harold was very good at living with lies. The sheriff arrived at Harold's farm just after sunrise, with 2 deputy cars behind him and an ambulance that would not be needed. Harold remained on his porch steps, his shotgun placed on the ground 5 feet away to show he meant no harm. The sheriff, a tired man named Billings who had known Harold for 30 years, walked up slowly and asked what had happened. Harold told his version of the story. He explained how he had discovered the body in Edward's basement, how Edward had offered him money to stay quiet, and how he had foolishly accepted because he was desperate to save his farm. He admitted to blackmail, to cowardice, and to every moral failure a man could commit. Then he described the meeting at the silo, the attack on Margaret, and the shot he had fired to save her. He led the sheriff to Edward's farmhouse and showed him the basement, where Edward's body lay exactly as Harold had left it. The sheriff examined the scene, read the suicide note, and asked Harold why Edward had killed himself instead of facing justice. Harold said he did not know, and that was not entirely a lie. He did not understand the mind of a man who could bury 4 human beings and then die for the shame of being caught. The sheriff ordered a search of Edward's property. By noon, the first body was found under a collapsed chicken coop. By evening, the other 3 were uncovered near the tree line, wrapped in the same kind of tarp Harold had seen in the basement. The town reacted with a mixture of horror and disbelief. Edward had been a trusted neighbor, a man who donated to the church and never raised his voice. No one could reconcile that image with the grim reality of what he had done. Margaret Doyle gave her own statement to the sheriff, confirming Harold's account of the silo. She did not mention the wrench or her demand for $20,000. She presented herself as an innocent bystander who had stumbled upon the truth and nearly paid for it with her life. Harold did not correct her. He had enough sins of his own without adding Margaret's to the list. The district attorney decided not to charge Harold with blackmail, citing his cooperation and the fact that Edward was dead and could not testify. Instead, Harold was charged with unlawful discharge of a firearm and reckless endangerment, misdemeanors that carried a fine and a suspended sentence. He paid the fine with the last of Edward's blood money, a final irony that made him sick to his stomach. The farm remained in Harold's name, but the bank had lost patience. The foreclosure notice arrived 2 weeks after Edward's body was removed from the basement. Harold did not fight it. He packed a single suitcase and walked away from the land that had been his entire life. He took a bus to a town he had never heard of, 300 miles away, where no one knew his name or his history. He found a room in a boarding house and a job at a lumber yard, stacking boards for 10 hours a day. His hands grew calloused again, but this time the work brought no pride. He ate alone, slept poorly, and spoke to no one about the past. The nightmares did not stop. He still dreamed of the pale hand, but now Edward was there too, standing in the shadows with his calm smile and his bleeding shoulder. In the dreams, Edward always asked the same question. "Why did you save her but not me?" Harold never had an answer. One night, 6 months after leaving the farm, Harold received a letter with no return address. Inside was a single photograph. It showed Margaret Doyle standing in front of a new car, smiling broadly, with a man who appeared to be her daughter's husband. On the back of the photograph, someone had written, "We remember." Harold did not know who had sent it or what they remembered. He did not know if Margaret had told someone the truth, or if Edward had left behind a final piece of evidence that Harold had missed. He burned the photograph in the sink of his boarding room and watched the flames curl around Margaret's smiling face. The next morning, he quit his job at the lumber yard and took another bus, farther this time, to a coastal town where the fog rolled in every evening and erased the line between sea and sky. He changed his name. He let his beard grow long. He told people he was a retired carpenter from the north, and no one asked for details. For 2 years, he lived that way, invisible and silent. Then one afternoon, while buying groceries at a small market, he saw a man he almost recognized. The man was tall and thin, with a nervous way of looking over his shoulder. He paid for his purchases with cash and left without saying a word to anyone. Harold followed him at a distance, his heart pounding. The man walked to a parked sedan and got into the driver's seat. Before closing the door, he turned and looked directly at Harold. It was Edward's older brother, a man named Paul Crane, who had moved to another state years ago and had no part in Edward's crimes. Paul stared at Harold for a long moment, then nodded once and drove away. Harold stood frozen on the sidewalk, wondering if Paul knew the truth, wondering if the photograph had been sent by him, wondering if his past would ever stop hunting him. He never saw Paul again. But the fear remained, a low hum beneath every thought and every action. Harold Mason, or whatever his name was now, understood that some choices cannot be undone. He had saved Margaret and killed Edward's chance at a trial. He had taken blood money and lied to the sheriff. He had escaped justice, but not guilt. The story ends where all such stories end, not with a bang or a twist, but with a man sitting alone in a rented room, listening to the rain, knowing that the peace he craves will never come. The pale hand still reaches for him in his dreams. The silent agreement he made with Edward did not die in that basement. It lives in Harold, every day, every hour, every breath. He will carry it to his grave. And that is the final truth of the matter. No detective solved the case. No technology revealed the bodies. No hotel, no restaurant, no mailman, no delivery driver, no apartment bedroom, no last shift. Just a failing farmer, a murderous neighbor, and a witness who wanted her share. 3 people trapped by a secret too heavy for any of them to hold. 2 of them are dead. The third is still running.